How's everybody this afternoon? That's my name, Rodney Salisbury. And you can see my very humble gravestone there. You see all these fancy graves, and I've just got a slab, no dates, not even my first name, just my first initial. But it kind of, I think, befits my humble origins. I was a dirt farmer for a good part of my life. I was born in Wisconsin. I was the oldest of 8 children. My parents moved from Wisconsin to North Dakota. I was so young I didn't even remember it. Brinsmade, North Dakota, or in that area, is where they homesteaded. I went to school through the 4th grade, and I dropped out because they needed my help on the farm, and I worked on the farm. I also did some dancing and singing, performing with my grandpa at different towns, just to raise a few nickels and dimes, you might say. It's kind of a funny story. My grandfather would show up, my grandpa and I would show up in a town, and usually a town then had a public outhouse, a latrine, and he'd go in there and pretend that he was locked in and couldn't get the door open, and kick up a fuss and pound and yell and holler, and this of course drew a crowd. Once we had the crowd there, then I could sing and dance, and we could perform and make a little money. You did anything you could when you were a dirt farmer in North Dakota and the crops didn't come in. But anyway, that's really not the main story of my life. The main story of my life happened after I married my dear wife Emma, and we moved to Sheridan County in northeastern Montana, near a town called Raymond, but we lived out on our 320-acre plot, which was the size of a homestead on dry land back then. And this was the early part of the 20th century. We made a good living on the farm for a while. Long as it rained, long as the crops came in, we did just fine. And for a while, things went really well, especially during the First World War, because the price of wheat was high. We were raising lots of wheat. We were making a good living, as were all of my fellow farmers. But then you might say the bottom fell out for a number of reasons. First of all, it quit raining, which is probably the worst thing that happened. But at the same time, after the war, the price of wheat fell. I think with less wheat, the price would go higher, instead it went lower. That's because it was being manipulated by the bankers on Wall Street, and the railroads were charging us unfair freight rates. And all of this exploitation was going on by bankers, by capitalists, by railroads. And for this reason, a man named Charles Taylor, who was a spellbinding speaker and one of the best newspaper editors known, one of the finest writers I've ever met, came to Plentywood and set up a newspaper called the Producer's News. This was in the early 1920s. Charles Taylor and I, you might say, and a lot of us in Sheridan County at the time, were of one mind. And he became a close friend of mine. And the main thing we wanted to do, of course, was fair and square run for election. And we ran for election with a group called the Nonpartisan League. We were socialists. Later we became a Farmer Labor Party, and we were communists. We weren't closet Reds, we weren't ashamed of the fact that we were communists. Keep in mind, at that time, the Soviet Union, which was red, of course, was not an enemy of the United States. Certain capitalists back east weren't particularly fond of the Soviet Union, but so be it. We offered the people a way to seize control of their own destiny, their means of production, and to stop the exploitation. And I think that's why we were elected in 1922. We were re-elected in 24, and again in 1926. We were the only county, as far as I've been able to tell, in the entire USA that was run by a communist government. All of the major office holders were red. And of course, being a communist and being the sheriff was kind of a contradiction for me. It posed many dilemmas, because I had to enforce the law as sheriff, and the laws themselves were written by the very people who were exploiting the farmers at the time. For example, you've heard of sheriff sales. Well, we had a lot of them back in the 1920s, because people were going broke and they were losing their land. And we had to have sheriff sales. I had no choice, of course, but to enforce the law and have sheriff sales, but here's something that I did do. On a day or two before we were going to go in and have a sheriff sales, and we weren't even supposed to tell them we were coming, but on a day or two before I knew we were going out there, I would tell my neighbors, because these people were my neighbors. They were my fellow farmers. They were my friends. I'd go out there and I'd tell them that we're going to be having a sheriff sale. If you have anything of value, you'd better move it to your neighbors. You better find a place for safekeeping, because we're going to be selling the whole place and everything on it. If that was wrong, you know, if that was not enforcing the laws I was accused of doing, so be it. I didn't really care. The other thing I was accused of a lot of stuff, but being in cahoots with the bootleggers was the main thing. This was a time, as many of you know, of prohibition when liquor was illegal, but it was a big going business, particularly in counties on the northern border along Canada. Liquor was very popular, and it was being run across the border by rum runners. The county and the whole northern end of Montana was filled with bootleggers, and you know, every farmer was making wine in somewhere in his cabin, or some people in their basements at the time. If I were to run in everybody that had illegal whiskey, the jail wouldn't have held them all. But I did the best I can. And if you don't believe me, you can take the word of the Helena Independent, you know, and this wasn't Charlie Taylor's newspaper, it was the Helena Independent, which implies it's an independent newspaper, and this is what it said of me at the time I was being accused of being in cahoots with the rum runners. It says, of course, Sheridan County has her problems along with other commonwealths, but its farmer labor government, and that was us, its farmer labor government seems to have brought into use all that is best for the minimizing the evil tendencies. Sheriff Rodney Salisbury, who has just entered upon his second term, appears a mastermind in his handling of criminals and criminal tendencies. The liquor question isn't worrying the people up there particularly. The county isn't dry by any means, but there is little bootlegging, and the stuff that is sold in the few regular places is the best to be had. And if complaint is made of violation, prosecution follows swiftly, and there is no favoritism, as there is no paying for protection up in Sheridan County. In practically every instance where arrests have been made for violation of the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, pleas of guilty have followed, and the people have escaped the all too common experience of having their tax money eaten up by the prosecution of liquor cases. The county jail harbors very few prisoners, and there is a minimum of misdemeanors and crime. Although I have to say at times we filled the jail with bootleggers and people running gin joints, but rather than just keep them in jail at the taxpayer expenses, we'd charge them a fine. We'd send the money to the school fund to please all of the churchgoers in town, and that took care of the problem. But as far as me taking bribes, I didn't take a bribe. They accused me of burning down a grain elevator at one point. The other thing they accused me of, right after our final election in 1926, the county payroll was robbed. Two masked gunmen came into the county treasurer's office and stole $100,000. Guess who they were trying to pin that rap on? Sheriff Salisbury. Why would I rob the payroll when my money was in there as well as everybody else's in town? There were robberies going on across the High Line at that time. A bank had just gotten robbed over in Malta, and that was probably, we suspected, the gang who pulled it off. They never did find who did that robbery, and we were never able to, unfortunately, recover the money. And it hurt me, and it hurt my friends. But I was accused of masterminding that, and of course, when I came up for re-election in 1928, that issue came up. And I'm afraid the other issue came up as they attacked my personal life, which I have to say, for most churchgoers, my personal life was certainly not above reproach. As I said, I had six children with my dear wife Emma, but sometime when I was sheriff, I met a woman who was actually working for the rival newspaper at the time, the Plentywood Herald, the one that published all the lies about me. But she would come to the sheriff's office, Marie Hansen was the lady's name, to get the news of the day from the sheriff's office. We struck up an acquaintance, which became a friendship, which became a very close friendship. And our very close friendship was always open, and everybody in town knew about us. We had 3 children of our own. Neither one of our spouses were willing to grant us a divorce, so we lived together. We eventually, after my defeat for election in 1928, we ended up moving to Billings, where I continued to work hard for the communist and the socialist cause that was so dear to me, as did Marie. And Emma, back in Plentywood, I would frequently visit my children, and Emma herself was a dedicated follower. We had a youth group there in Plentywood that our children were members of. And a little bit about that youth group, they were called the Young Pioneers. and they met in the Farmer Labor Temple that our government, by the way, our communist government in Plentywood in Sheridan County, erected that building. And when probably the greatest tragedy in my life was the death of Emma and my dear young daughter at the age of 14. She died of a burst appendix, and this was in 1932. That year was the year, by the way, that I ran for governor of Montana as a communist. Didn't do too well. Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal were a lot more popular then, but that's another story. But shortly before that time, Janice passed away, and here's the story that appeared about the funeral. Our dear young pioneer, Janice Salisbury, who died on Tuesday, March 1st, following an operation for appendicitis, was buried on Saturday afternoon. The funeral services for Janice were those for a Bolshevik. Many farmers and townspeople were forced to stand in the Farmer Labor Temple, which was crowded to capacity when the funeral started at 2:30. The coffin was accompanied from the entrance to the front of the hall by the young pioneers, led by 2 pioneers bearing a red flag. When the coffin had been placed in the front of the hall, the pioneers arranged the flowers, which had been sent by the young pioneers, her schoolmates. The United Farmers League, which was our communist group at the time, and the Producers News, and the Communist Party USA and others. The windows and the stage were covered with red and black drapings, decorated with hammer and sickle emblems over the flowers on the coffin. The pioneers draped the red flag. Led by the pioneers, the audience rose and participated in the singing of the Internationale, the hymn of the toiling masses throughout the world. Comrade Hans Rasmussen then opened the services with a few words on the terrible loss we had suffered through the death of our beloved comrade. Not your regular church funeral, and because of that, this story spread from New York to Los Angeles and made big news in the Los Angeles Times. As I may have mentioned, Sheridan County was the only truly red communist county during the 1920s. This was sometime after that, of course, when we were falling out of favor a little bit, but there were those of us who remained dedicated to that cause even throughout the early 1930s. The group that I became active in, and because of my being active in this group, I was kicked out of the Communist Party by the leaders back east who thought we had to toe their line completely and take our orders from New York, who took their orders from Moscow. We were a little more independent-minded out here in Montana. But this group that I worked very hard on throughout the 1930s was a group to Farmers Holiday Alliance, I believe it was called, and our main goal was to get farmers to keep their crops off the market until the price went up, to hold their crops off the market, to not plant until the price rose. Later, of course, this became a reality with the Agricultural Adjustment Act of Mr. Roosevelt. Holding your crops off the market and not planting certain years and certain things became common practice. We were ahead of our time. But because of my involvement with this, I had a falling out with my friend Charlie Taylor, who by then wasn't even living much in Sheridan County and was taking his marching orders from back east. They brought in a young reporter who went to school in New York City and was from Columbia University educated, knew nothing about farmers, and he was editing the Producers News out there in Plentywood. So that's another reason we lost just a lot of our following during the 1930s, I think. I passed away at a fairly early age. I was 50, feeling great, living here in Missoula, where I was continuing the work for the cause, and I went back to Plentywood just to visit visit Emma and my family in Plentywood, and I suffered what they said was a cerebral hemorrhage at the time, but even then, my enemies were trying to smear the very death I had. They tried to smear my dear friend Marie, accused her of poisoning me, which could not have been further from the truth. I had a stroke, for heaven's sake. And that was the way that it was. And that's all that I remember until I woke up here on this fine morning, guarding the gates of the cemetery in Missoula, Montana. And who would think that a dedicated communist would be guarding the very gates of the cemetery in Missoula? But you can rest assured I'll enforce the law here to the best of my ability, even though I still am a red. If you have questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
When you were 50, Rodney, what year would that have been?
1938.
And how would you have traveled from Missoula to Plentywood in that day?
By train mostly. I took the train. Yeah. and they carried me back here, obviously, by train. I mentioned my daughter, Janice. I don't know if I mentioned, she was reinterred here in Missoula. Her grave is over yonder. I'm not sure exactly where it is over there. They were going to show me, but I hope they show me before I have to go back into my grave later today. Any other questions?
The name of the county you were...
Sheridan County. It's in the furthest northeast corner of Montana. And they're just now starting to talk openly about, there's a great book that's come out about this. It's called The Red Corner. Verlaine McDonald, who is actually a descendant of Rodney Salisbury's undersheriff, I believe, was the author of that. It can be found in most of the bookstores in town. She's supposed to be here sometime today.
I'm in this part. I missed it. I just got here.
I'll be retelling the story many times over, and we'll catch you the next time around.
So Ivan Doig's book, Bucking the Sun, was about the dam that was built in Glasgow. That's pretty closely aligned, and there's a big section in that about.
Oh, yeah, he talks about that in a chapter. Right, I remember that. It's been a while since I read that book, but yep.
It was right about that time.
Yep. It was a little bit earlier than that, but and I'm not sure how, in what context he got the communists in Sheridan County into his story about building the Fort Peck Dam, but he found a way to do that. It's been a while since I...
Europe was a wobbly. And
oh, okay, yeah.
So.
Yeah, actually, the communists up in Sheridan County weren't wobblies. Wobblies actually were more prominent out here in Missoula because they were active in the lumber camps.
And I was curious, what brought Rodney Salisbury to Missoula from Billings in support of his...
That's a question that I can't answer yet. Okay. That's not in Verlaine's book, really, other than she said that they moved to Missoula, where he continued to work for the cause. And that's about all I know about it. One thing, I did talk to Rodney's daughter, who lives in Billings, and it's she is the daughter of Rodney and Marie, his paramour, and she told me her story is a little bit different because she said Rodney was actually reinterred here, and they were still living in Billings at the time. So you kind of take your pick with that, but she said the main reason that both Rodney and later Marie, or Emma, his wife, and their kids moved to Arlee, where they were on a farm, was to be near the university where they wanted their kids to go to school. See, all of the women that Rodney was associated with, whether it be his wife or his mistresses, were very well educated and very cultured ladies, and they were very much believers in education. Emma was a school teacher. Marie was, I think, an artist among a lot of other things. So, yeah.